Well, hello everybody, and good afternoon. Let me kick off by saying that despite that starry introduction, I'm not going to be talking so much today about law as I'm almost going to be talking about anthropology and sociology, because I think that law exists in a particular social context, and it is a means of crafting and reflecting the society which gives it birth. Those thoughts came to me very much this morning when I was listening to Jimmy Wales, because I think this particular area of standard setting provides, for the sociologists amongst us, a very, very clear example of the conflict of cultures which is being fought out in the world more generally, the fight between the open and the closed. So I'm going to start by asking a bleeding obvious question. Why do we need standards? I think you would all instinctively say, well, without standards, we have chaos, you don't achieve interoperability, there's no way for things to grow. And that is all true. And indeed, in the European context, we had the European Interoperability Framework number 1 in 2004, and the revised version coming out in 2011, which very much saw the need to craft standards which, or indeed any software, which allowed interoperability. And when patents got in the way, then they effectively called for FRAND licensing terms. Well, I'm going to come back a little bit in a little while to the whole question of FRAND licensing terms, because I think arguably FRAND is not our friend. But let's think a little bit more about that model. That's a model which sees the world in the kind of paternalistic, well-meaning, standard-setting organisation, the industry all cooperating with one another for the great and public good. And I went and left on my seat my iPhone, but I was going to read to you the quote from Adam Smith, where he talks about the invisible hand. But to paraphrase it, it is that the wealthy individual with vast estates produces so much, looking to his own self-interest, he produces so much that at the end of the day, he can't consume it all, and then it trickles down, to use the Reaganite term, and hence even self-interest can be advancing the common good. Well, I wonder. Does anybody remember the Philips against VHS against Betamax wars? There's one or two of us in the room who are old enough to remember that. The thing that was about that was there was no absence of standards. Each was a separate and competing, entirely proprietary standard, and it was a battle as to which one was going to win. And it's not a battle which results in the objectively best standard winning. It's a battle which resulted in a kind of Darwinian fittest standard winning. Fittest doesn't mean doing your bit on the rowing machine. It means most fit for the context, the milieu. And the thing about this particular battle was that probably the least technically good system was VHS, but it did deals with film distributors, and in the UK bought out an entire the dominant chain of video rental shops. So they created market conditions. And so when we're talking about competing standards unmoderated in a purely technical, in a purely market context, you don't know what result you're going to get, and it isn't necessarily any good for the public as a whole. But there's more than merely that, because even if you don't have that kind of battle for standards and who's going to win, standards are going to emerge anyway. They might emerge as purely de facto standards. I remember my frustration as an ODT user way back, trying to communicate with anybody who used Microsoft Office. And Microsoft Office, and particularly DocX, especially DocX, which was not an ISO standard, it was a purely proprietary standard, but it was in those days not interoperable. And I mean, I could tell everybody till I was blue in the face that I was using the ISO standard, and they were not. But it didn't do me any good. So you've got to think then of this kind of struggle for the de facto standards emerging anyway. So standard setting can be used to iron that out, to make everybody live not exactly happily ever after, but it can be used to consolidate an economic dominance. I mean, think about more recently the DVD standard battle and the companies that invested in the high-quality DVD, or whatever it was called. They lost their investment. Those who invested in the other won. Now, why does it all matter? Well, I'm going to go a little bit into this business of embedded patents. Many standards have in them embedded patents. But here's a figure for you. I don't really believe in figures, a bit like 1066 and all that. One figure per lecture is enough. Here we go. 70% of embedded patents are owned by 7 companies. Now, they're not there, and we don't criticize them for it. That's the nature of the model. They're not there for altruism. They try to go down the European interoperability framework by saying, okay, you can interact with our standards on FRAND terms, or even more rarely, RAND 0 terms. But question for you, what is fair? What is reasonable? And when you say non-discriminatory, does that mean you must discriminate against everybody equally? You see, these are subjective terms. And FRAND is why I say is not our friend. But there is a particular issue with open source software. A gentleman asked earlier the question. The answer is, I can give you a citation in a moment, but the answer very broadly put is that most open source software licenses do allow full interoperability with embedded patents. But the GPL family does not. That is not, if you want to know the technical reasons, we don't have enough time to go into it. There's an article, Mitchell and Mason, Mitchell being me, Compatibility of the Licensing of Embedded Patents with Open Source Licensing Terms, which you'll find in the International Free and Open Source Software Law Review, Volume 3, Number 1, from as long ago as 2011. But basically, it has partly to do with an incompatibility with the cascade model of GPL licensing with a more traditional licensing and sub-licensing and assignation type model of a conventional licensing. But it's also a matter of deliberate policy on the part of Eben Muglin, whom I spoke to about it, because Eben's a take on this was that he had a visceral dislike of software patents. And one must not speak ill of the great guru, but I think a perhaps naive idea that, well, if you just made the GPL impossible to interact with and link into embedded patents in standards, then the patents would just shrivel up and die. Well, I'm afraid that's just not happened. But we have seen, and I'm indebted here, it's another chapter in the book, when Amanda asked me to talk about this at rather short notice. I said, help, panic, which chapter in the book should I read? And actually, what you will find useful on this, although it is a little bit of an academic read, is Blind, Boner and Thrum, the incompatibility issue. Hang on, I'll just give you the exact. Here we are, that's it. Opens higher. I am getting a. Knut Blind, Mirko Bohm, and Nicholas Thrum. There's a lengthy article, the paper they did for the European Commission, but it's distilled in chapter 11 of the book. And it's a serious bit of academic research, rather than a string of bad jokes, which is how I tend to do these things, where what they do is they look at a number of test cases, and they discern there are three common standard setting models. There is the standard setting by the standard setting organization, which is then there is the implementation first model. Now, the thing about implementation first is it's like a benign version of the Darwinian struggle for standards just to emerge anyway. What happens here is people cooperate, they develop implementations, and that drives what they need to put into the standard. And they may well get away without needing to put a patented item into the standard. I don't know, but it's developed by the community. And then there is also the hybrid approach, where you get both operating in parallel. Now, there's one thing which I find rather concerning about the study which they carried out, and they deal with it rather briefly. They tend to minimize what happens if you've got a developer who is using, for example, the GPL and can't interact with the standard, or for some other reason chooses not to interact with the standard. Well, what they say, I quote, is that these stakeholders typically resolved these issues or typically worked around them. Now, I just wonder how that's actually possible when you've got a I can understand there might be nifty workarounds, but if you've got an essential patent, it is by definition essential, and you just can't work around it unless everybody closes their eyes to what would be a flagrant breach of licensing terms, but particularly, of course, a breach of the GPL licensing terms. And the GPL, as if you remember, Mission Impossible self-destructs as soon as it touches a patent. And in fact, that's recognized because what they say is, if no solutions are found, in particular, small organizations withdraw from standardization. Well, that's really pretty chilling in every sense of the word. And it brings me on to another issue, which I think I could just touch on briefly, and that is the work that's going on in the Association for Open Standards, Open Media, I beg your pardon, where it's a rather nerdy, narrow argument as to whether there is full reciprocity required, and whether, in fact, you're paying for the product without actually really knowing about it. Like, you get a free bottle of water in your hotel room, but is actually on your hotel bill. But the reason and it is quite a technical subject, again, it's not something I want to get into today particularly, but one of the solutions that has been put forward is that you can avoid having the standard imposed on you if you simply say out of the working group which is creating the standard. But that doesn't work, because you're caught with the obligations that have been created, whether you've been in the working group or not, if you end up implementing that standard. So there is a real problem. I'm going to finish my remarks fairly quickly, because I've hijacked a guest to come along and say a couple of words, because it's just some practical experience which I don't have. But it seems to me, before I hand over to Lonneke Drijssen, who is the director of the Open Charge Alliance, who worked on creating a standard, that she'll share a few thoughts with me about her actual discussions with a traditional standard-setting organisation, so you can get a sense of the two cultures. But it seems to me that what we're ended up here with is, if a small organisation cannot interoperate, it's not just that they withdraw from standardisation, but they shut themselves out of the entire field of endeavour governed by that particular standard. You do not then end up getting competition and diversity. You end up getting quite the opposite. And we have what Jimmy Wales talked about this morning, the two fundamentally incompatible cultures. On the one hand, what he described as the feudal model, where the developers, the vassals, enter onto the Lord's land and there do their own thing, but under the superintendence of the Lord. Or on the other hand, the idea of the commons, are they doing things together and in common? I don't tend to like such political analogies terribly much, but I do think they express the two fundamental cultures. And so I have spent quite a lot of time telling you what the problem is, and no time whatsoever in telling you what the answer is. That's for you to figure. But can I hand over now and ask Lonneke to tell us a little bit about her practical experience with standards?
Thank you, Iain. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Lonneke Drijssen, and I work for a Dutch non-profit organization called the Open Charge Alliance. And we have been developing an open source standard for EV charging infrastructure since 2009. From day one, when we started the standard in EV charging, which basically it's very simple, it's no rocket science, is explaining to a charging station when to start charging, when to stop charging, send the meter readings, do a firmware update. That's it. So it's nothing really special. And we developed it with an open source mindset. We distributed it for free, no licensing, no IP, just to let the market grow. And we knew that there were, particularly in this new market, some companies who were going for the proprietary model, developing their own systems with patents in it. And we were never out for a standards war, never. So we thought, and now it turns out a bit naively, so we'll just do our open source thing. Other companies just do their proprietary thing, and everybody just choose what they want, and no issues. Well, the first time we sort of realized this was not going to happen was when in the United States companies saw this open source development and wanted to adopt it and took OCPP, which is the name for our standard, to North America. But that triggered a response from the then market leader with a proprietary system, stating that we were sort of invading on their turf and we should allow them to also develop OCPP, but with inclusion of their patents. And then we, of course, said, well, no. So, yeah, we're open source, so you can join, but then, yeah, no IP. And that sort of escalated to the fact that they accused us of violating the violation of the Sherman Act, trademark infringement, patent infringement, unfair competition, and restraint of trade. So, to cut a long story short, we were taken to court. We were generously helped, amongst others, by the Open Invention Network. They lost their court case for the district court. They went to the Court of Appeals in the United States. They lost. And then they filed a complaint in front of the US Supreme Court. And the complaint was dismissed. So that battle, sort of, we won. So then we thought, okay, well, now this is the standards war is okay, and the story ends really well. So this particular company joined the Open Charge Alliance more than 1.5 years ago, and they're very actively working in working groups, and they are helping us move forward. So that ended very well for us. And again, we thought, well, we'll live happily as an open source community in the future. But then the next standards battle that we are sort of forced to have is with standards organizations such as IEC and ISO. And I can explain a bit more how that plays out. So there are formal standard setting organizations that develop standards in general for all sorts of things. And when they noticed that our open source standard was very successful and very useful, they invited us to join. And we said again, okay, well, we want to join, but no IP. That topic was sort of pushed aside, like we don't discuss IP, so ignore it. And we were sort of like, okay, we've had our other experience. But the main issue with these organizations was that they basically tell us, until today, that the way we develop our open source standard is wrong. So what we do is we made something in 2009, we implement it, we make mistakes, we learn new things, and we improve upon the version in an agile way. So sort of every 3 years we publish a newer version of the standard, which has more features, more improvements, more clear. And every version is not perfect and not complete. This agile way of development, we feel, is fitting the developing nature of this industry. But what a standards organization, particularly IEC, tells us is this is not the way you develop a standard. The way you do, apparently, is first of all, you think of use cases. So what am I going to use it for? And once you do that, then you define an information model. So what is a charging station? What are its components? And then, as a next step, you develop the messages, and then you have your standard. So our reasoning is, of course, well, you don't know exactly what your use cases are going to be. It's still evolving. There are new ideas from India, new ideas from Korea. So it's impossible to already figure out exactly how you're going to use it. The second part, what is a charging station? It can have one plug, two plugs, a display. It could have a connection to a network. It could not have. It could not. So it is also what is a charging station is also not yet really 100% defined. So the second step that we needed to take is also something that we think, well, maybe that's not the best approach. So again, what we thought, well, okay, so if they want to do it differently, if they think they have a different approach, fine, we'll just go on our merry way and keep developing our open source standards. And if they want to develop another standard, fine.
Like, I might just cut into you there because we're getting near our time. I think it would be good to have probably enough time, 5 minutes, for a few questions. But what you've just said, I think, really exemplifies the two very different ways of doing things, and what I described as the culture wars. It'll be interesting to see which of the competing standards, if that's what you end up with, ends up on top. But Lonneke, thank you for the practical experience. Come have a seat with me. And questions, people? Yeah.
Nicholas Singelin, data ethicist. Love both your approaches. But I think we're just trying to compare two things that you can't compare. Because the whole point about open data, the whole thing, that it's a value-based, it's a normative value-based concept. It's driven by the idea that information should be shared, Therefore, there's an automatic conflict with patents. And I'm not taking sides. And I think if you're talking about a value-driven, a belief, a passion-driven, and it's about sharing, it's about equity, it's just another model of being, right? And I think the process of developing standards with this kind of open idea, which is value-driven, has to be more looking at human right impact assessments, perhaps. And I think if you start to apply processes of developing standards when it's purely technical, which are vital, I want my fridge not to blow up. So, I mean, I agree with the strict process-oriented way of making standards if it's a fridge or a car. I think with open data, we need to look at new ways of developing standards, ?
Well, we've got two at the moment, third in the sort of parallel approach, but it is underlying what I'm saying. There are two worldviews, and how do you reconcile them? I think we've got another question there from the gentleman.
Hi, yeah, just to follow on from the question I asked this morning, or earlier, sorry. The open source, the licenses of open source generally don't talk about patents.
Correct.
So when you have standards and the standards are being developed through ETSI or these other organizations, and they have, for whatever reason, chosen to use reference implementations or open source reference implementations, do the open source licenses attached give you access or to the patents that may be attached to those standards?
You have to do a license-by-license comparison. I don't want to tell you what the position now is, because the paper that I did was 12 years ago now. It was 2011. But at that time, permissive licenses caused no problems whatever. There were some licenses which were silent, but it was very specifically the GPL which caused the conflicts, and that had been deliberately engineered by the authors of the GPL family. But if you were wanting to use a license now and decide, you would really just have to carefully examine the license terms. Sometimes it's not as obvious as saying no patents. Sometimes it's got to do with a fundamental mismatch with the licensing cascade model. I think Andrew knows a bit about this, and he's got something to say.
Just very quickly, when I use this discussion point to say, well, open source is a great model to share, then people working in standards tend to go, but no, you can't share because there are patents behind a lot of this stuff. And
well, yes, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm advising an organisation at the moment that's it's an industry body, but it's sort of turned into a standard-setting organisation. So we're basically putting an IP policy together for them. What we're doing in the policy is we're saying that to implement this standard, we're going to create reference implementations, reference libraries, and these libraries are going to be released under the Apache license, which is, as you know, one of the licenses that does have an explicit patent license in it. So the idea is that all of those organizations, and there are some pretty big, well-known organizations involved, are going to be using the Apache license as the patent license. So there is also a backup license which they're offering as part of the terms of entering into essentially the consortium agreement. But we think the cleanest thing to do is to make sure that the libraries that are going to implement this standard are available under an Apache license, so people can rely on that Apache license.
Excellent. Thank you very much.